You're now listening to the Adiel Gorel Show. Each episode, I'll bring you the latest news from my discussions with top health and wellness experts so that you can bring yourself into better health. Today, on the Adiel Gorel Show.
No, that alone does it. I sat down with my publishers and we talked about whether there should be metabolism reset or liver reset. But I first started this approach for reversing type 2 diabetes. And that was about in the late 1990s. And we became quite comfortable taking people who were on multiple medications, still not well controlled, and having them stop their medications on day one. And we would see that 6 weeks out, they were now.
And everything, it really has to do with you change your routine, and because of that, you eat less. You might lose weight. That's really what it seems to be, right?
Well, and we're talking about weight, but we really want to lose fat, and you're exactly right. So with metabolism reset, when you're consuming less food, you've got to have a deficit to lose any kind of weight. You've got to have some kind of a deficit. Now the problem is that your body's protein requirements, they don't change. You can skimp on carbs or fat and you'll no problem from that. But if your protein intake goes below some threshold, you're going to chew up more of your muscle mass. You'll use more of that for fuel. So with the metabolism reset, I include some healthy carbohydrates, some healthy fats, but I work hard to make sure that no one goes into a protein deficit. And that way, when it's all over, they've held on to their muscle fat. It targets the weight loss to be from fat and from the more toxic kinds of fat.
So if somebody is watching this or listening to this in the car and they say, well, I would like to have access to this diet, what should they do?
Easiest thing, we've got all this data online for free. If they just search Metabolism Reset Challenge, they'll find this. I've got a full book about that, tons of meal planning and menus, that's available as well.
What's the name of that book?
It's all online. That's the Metabolism Reset Diet.
Oh, well.
And all bookstores have that. The basic idea is I talk about how to do specific plant-based protein shakes for breakfast and lunch, how to have vegetable snacks if needed between meals, and how to make a pretty healthy dinner, which can be, omnivores, gluten-free, vegans, anyone can do it. There's a lot of options for anyone. So you're doing a shake, a good meal, snacks as an option. That's the broad outline of that, but that's a 28-day process. And that's made to really target the fat from the organs and make the metabolism stable again.
Very good. What's the name of the website?
That's metabolismresetdiet.com. That's there too.
Not surprising.
If anyone Googles that, they'll find it.
Not surprising. So, I would like to step back. You mentioned, the liver, a couple of times, but if you don't mind, let's step back and start at a point that's a little more basic. Can you tell us about the liver's role in all this discussion?
That's a cool thing. So our bodies use thousands of chemicals in any given moment. And ultimately, everything that we use, comes in from our diet. So right now, we're using glucose, we're using micronutrients, we're making amino acids, but yet you and I aren't eating at this moment. So the main hub of stored stuff is the liver. We consume food, we consume nutrients, we make hormones, we store these things, and our liver releases exactly what we need when we need it and keeps all these things buffered. If there's more than what we need, it holds on to it till later. If there's too little, it puts some out into circulation, almost like a strategic oil reserve or something, but it does that for thousands and thousands of compounds. So it does that for our fuel as well. And fuel is carbs, fats, ketones. Those are the body's main fuel sources. So when we consume them, whatever we burn in the moment, we burn, but we can never burn all of what we consume in the moment. So the rest goes in the liver. And a healthy liver lets that out and keeps our energy up even when we're not eating. But the problem is that people get to where their liver can store but cannot release. If that goes on long enough, that gets diagnosed as fatty liver syndrome. But a massive number of adults may not be that far along, but they are far enough along to where they gain weight easier than they lose weight. And if they do lose weight, they feel awful and they're wiped out. And that means the liver is not effectively able to release energy on demand.
And what causes that?
Well, a lot of factors. We see that low levels of certain nutrients, a lot of the wastes that are common in the modern world, a lot of plastic derivatives, toxic metals. Chronic stress levels can affect that. Changes in the body's timing of when we sleep, when we wake up. So a lot of common stuff in the modern world, and many things that have changed, especially in these last several decades. One of the biggest switches that occurred was somewhere around the 80s, and that was when many people were working on time zones different from their own. That's when there was more and more shift work increase. So yeah, a lot of these factors collectively made it to where the obesity rates have shot up, and that's when it started picking up the most rapidly.
So if we have a person who lives a relatively healthy lifestyle, maybe not very, very healthy, but reasonable, they sleep at the same time, they don't have any time zone issues, their stress level is moderate, just like, most people. In that person, what could still cause this?
Well, there's a separate question from what makes something start and what can reverse it. So those various factors, low amounts of things like magnesium, too little amounts of different fibers in the diet, lack of good diversity in the flora. But it doesn't have to be catastrophic things. This is a case to where a small imbalance amplified over time causes big changes. And once they've occurred, even if you were to address some of those initial causes, that might not reverse it. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, right? But a seatbelt might have kept him from falling. But a seatbelt won't put him back together after he's fallen and cracked. And that's the case. Sometimes small causes can compound in ways that even if you address them, it doesn't reverse the consequences.
So if somebody is already in a certain stage leading to fatty liver, disease, how can you put Humpty Dumpty back, together again?
Well, that's the cool thing, and that this is really about the liver and its resilience. So of all of our organs, it's the most able to regenerate. And even with many stages of mildly advanced fatty liver, it can reverse. In theory, we can lose 80% of our liver mass, and it can regenerate back again. So yeah, the liver has that potential, and given the right circumstances, it can repair itself.
So what would be the steps to take for people to make that better? Is it, the 28-day diet that we talked about now, or is there more that they can?
It is. No, that alone does it. I sat down with my publishers and we talked about whether there should be metabolism reset or liver reset. But I first started this approach for reversing type 2 diabetes. And that was about in the late 1990s. And we became quite comfortable taking people who were on multiple medications, still not well controlled, and having them stop their medications on day one. And we would see that 6 weeks out, they were now unmedicated and non-diabetic by following an approach like this. We became quite confident in that. And I learned that for many of these people, the core issue behind their diabetes was the fact that they had early fatty liver disease. And then we started realizing more and more that even those who weren't yet diabetic, many who had weight struggles had early stages of this fatty liver as well. So that's the real core issue, and it's very common. One study looked at advanced fatty liver, and it showed that if you test by the most accurate methods, which is a biopsy, if you screen people who were planning to donate liver tissue to a loved one, so if someone's liver is failing, a relative could donate some liver tissue to them. And if someone does that, they go through a lot of evaluative steps. They're first tested to make sure they've got no obvious liver disease by blood tests, by ultrasound, and finally by biopsy. So people that are healthy, normal body weight, non-diabetic, everything is clear. That last step, so everything else was great, 40% of the time in situations like that, they have advanced fatty liver disease. So advanced, this is when there's no signs of it. Right. So we know that it's there much more common than people suspect. And we know that most who do have this overfat have some stage of fatty liver.
Okay, so that person, in your example, that is going to donate, a portion of their liver to a loved one, they just went through all the tests and the tests were normal, except for that last bit, just like you said. In their daily life, how does that person, how is he or she likely to feel? Normal, or something is already up?
Well, typically the earliest signs are those of that metabolic change. I call it metabolic flexibility. Right now we're not eating food, but we're expending energy. And our metabolism takes a prior meal and releases some of the energy into our bloodstream. So fatigue, poor mental function, easy weight gain, they're two sides of the same coin. When we can't store energy and release it effectively, we don't have stable energy. We don't feel good. Our mood goes up and down. We can't concentrate well. And because we're not liberating that energy, we're storing it. And so in those cases, it seems like, if I eat like a bird, I'm okay. But if I have one piece of cake, I gain 2 pounds. That's exactly how it plays out. Or someone will say, if I starve myself, I'll lose a few pounds, but it comes right back again afterwards and then some. So those are all signs that the body is not storing and releasing properly.
There's a central message here, I think, that many people need to listen to. You mentioned that person that we talked about might be walking around, maybe a little brain fog, maybe a little tired. And then let's say that the person is 60 years old. They maybe even go to their doctor, and many times they will hear, well, you're 60 years old. Those are normal things.
Right. Yeah.
Not normal.
No, you're so right about that. And the problem is that these sorts of things, like I said, they build up over time, and we often blame them on aging. Something doesn't work well for 20 years, it gets worse and worse and worse. And we think, oh, that's just 20 years of age. Well, no, that's a problem that festered for 20 years. It's not always age. But yeah, we're too quick to accept these things and blame them on inevitable changes.
Right. I think that's a super important point, because really many people, based on the media, their doctors, general knowledge, just assume, look, I'm getting older. Obviously, I'll feel worse. Obviously, I'll forget things. No, I don't think it's obvious.
Well, and of course we change with age. There's no way around some of that. But we always used to think that people had a slower metabolism as they aged. We now know that that's only because they lose muscle mass as they age. The people that age that don't lose muscle mass, they have no changes in their metabolic rate. They need the same amounts of food as someone younger does. So yeah, there's no inherent change in metabolism that goes along with age.
We talked before some activities that can actually build muscle mass is maybe weight training. And once again, some people feel, no, I'm too old, to do that.
Yeah, there's been some awesome studies showing that people who are 80, 90 years old can still grow muscle tissue just fine. Yeah, it takes a good amount of strength training, not unreasonable, and it takes being at a positive balance of protein. So in the book, I talk a lot about this whole 28-day reset, but I talk a lot about maintenance. So what goes on between, like all the rest of the time. And one big thing is getting adequate amounts of high-quality protein. So coupled with exercise, then yes, the body can retain muscle
So
tissue.
just to be helpful to our viewer/listeners right now, what are the protein requirements for regular people, male, female? They exercise, they don't exercise. What would you say would be, the ballpark?
I'll throw a couple of numbers out there because there's amounts below which we see deficiencies. And those are often talked about as like the ideal target. And it's not an ideal target. Just because you're not sick doesn't mean you're well. So somewhere around 0.4 of a gram of protein per 2 pounds of body weight or per kilogram is probably enough to prevent a protein deficiency. But that's not enough to maintain
Hold on.
muscle
Let me
mass
just
throughout
repeat
the
that,
aging
because
cycle.
that was a little fast. 0.4
Yeah.
grams of protein per kilogram of body weight.
Right. So I'm about 75 kilos. So based upon that, I could do about 40 grams of protein per day and not develop a protein deficiency. And that's true. Protein deficiencies don't really happen. But in terms of holding on to muscle mass, it's a much bigger number. So to retain muscle mass, it takes about a gram of protein per pound of lean body weight. So give an example. If a woman is 20% body fat and 140 pounds, so she would have 35 pounds, she'd have 28 pounds of body fat. So she would then have 112 pounds of lean body mass. So she would need about 112 grams of protein a day to maintain that. Now to grow muscle mass, it's a little higher.
So what you described now, you described a relatively, actually a medium-sized woman, but that's not a big person. For such a person, consuming 112 grams of protein a day might be a bit of a challenge.
Carbs, fats, and proteins, those are our main macronutrients. We need some of all of them, But as far as the amounts that give us optimal muscle mass for aging, it takes some thought to really get those protein targets. It's by default, people can often get too little for
And
sure.
you're saying that if somebody is actually building muscle mass, they would need more than the
Yeah.
1 gram per pound of lean body weight.
Yeah, so if someone wishes to grow muscle or grow bone, if they've had bone thinning, this is kind of the same thing, then they need about a gram per pound of their ideal body weight. So if they're very heavy, that might change. It might not be of their current body weight, but they might need about a gram per pound of what their ideal body weight would
I
be.
see. Those are much larger quantities than most people get, and especially when people go, we talked, before on diets, like the intermittent fasting. Then you are limiting things. You may get even less.
Well, that's the thing is that the protein, especially, we now also know that there's protein feeding windows. We used to think it was important that you could only get a certain amount of protein per meal. We now know that's less of a concern. But if you've got more than 5, 6 hours between sources of protein, you're always going to borrow from your muscles. You're always going to pull some out. So yeah, for maintenance, we know it's healthier to have protein spread out throughout the day, not because you can't absorb a lot at once, but because you need it
So
on an
now
ongoing
we go
basis.
back to the intermittent fasting, and I'm going to use the same example I did before, the 16-8, which is very, very common. You eat all your food in a window of 8 hours. Well, by definition,
Mhm.
for 16 hours, you get zero protein that you eat.
And there have been many examples of people that have large amounts of body weight to lose, that behaviorally they may end up eating less food during that, and they may do really well. But for those that maybe don't have as far to go and they're looking to hold on to their muscle mass for longer periods of time, that's a problem. And that's shown up in several large trials. We've seen a lot of loss of muscle mass from those that have longer fasting
Well, but it
periods.
seems like it's almost, you said that in an ideal situation, we should get some protein into our bodies every 5 to 6 hours, 4, 5, 6, hours. Well,
Well, we're
I'm
awake,
sorry,
yeah.
while we are awake. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we're awake.
So I see. Yeah. Well, this is all unbelievably fascinating. I want to move around and ask you about some other things. And it looks like I'm jumping over to this side, but this is all interesting. You mentioned the
Okay.
benefit of L-citrulline. Can you talk about that?
Kind of a neat thing. So there's many compounds that are relevant for energy production within the Krebs cycle. And citrulline is one of those. It's a conditionally essential amino acid. So our bodies need it and we can usually make it, but there are times where we cannot make enough. There are a few food sources of that we find, but it has a role to play in just helping energy production increase.
So, how does a person know whether they need to supplement with citrulline? If they do, how do they supplement? What's the form? Is it powder? Is it a pill?
We'll find this in powders and capsules. And when I formulate products that help to regulate adrenal function and regulate energy output, I will often include that. And anywhere between 100 to 400 milligrams can be quite useful and no big drawbacks to it.
Well, I mean, luckily, the people who want to know more about this can just look it up. L-citrulline. And I think it's on your website as well, right?
Yep, I've written about that recently.
So now I believe you also mentioned, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, butyrate.
Butyrate, huh?
I was close. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Pretty amazing thing in terms of gastrointestinal health, good absorption of nutrients, lower risk of colorectal cancer, fewer gastrointestinal symptoms. Butyrate is a short chain fatty acid and it's fuel for our good bacteria. And many data points have shown that the more someone has butyrate in their colon, the better the health of their colon tends to be over time. So yeah, they've tried to figure out ways to raise butyrate, and you can put butyrate in pills. They are available. The drawback is the quantities we need are so large. So it seems that there's a compound called resistant starch, which is in the diet and in supplements, and it's not butyrate, but our good bacteria convert it into butyrate. So that's by far the most effective way to raise our butyrate levels.
So they talked about resistant starch being good for our microbiome and the good bacteria. A lot of people talk about supplementing with probiotics. So resistant starch seems like it would lay, the foundation for those things to live and thrive on, right?
You're exactly right. There's also benefits to stabilizing blood sugar as well. So yeah, very, very good thing to have in the
So when we
diet.
say resistant starch, again, to be more specific for our listeners, our viewers, what would be sources that we would know, whether in a supplement form or not, of resistant starch?
Well, the main food sources are going to be from carbohydrates. So in the family of carbohydrates, there's some that are undigestible that are called fibers, and there's those that are digestible. Resistant starch is in between, so thus resistant. So it is digestible, but it resists digestion in the upper intestinal tract. It's only digested by the good bacteria in the colon. And in foods, we find this in potatoes, especially those that are cooked at lower temperatures like boiling. Also white beans. So it's like white beans, but also cannellini and navy. So all white colored beans. And then bananas and plantains, especially when they're not overly ripe. So those three categories are by far the densest sources of resistant
Now, when
starch.
somebody goes into a health food store, they will see in a packet green banana made into powder. Will that be, as beneficial?
Well, I made a product called RS Complete, and it's a resistant starch blend. When I made that, I started making it about 7 years ago. And I thought I could just order raw materials from supplement companies, from the manufacturers, and get the raw banana flour, green banana flour, unmodified potato starch. I figured I could just buy these things and have them blended together properly, and it would work out fine. What I learned was that the raw materials may not have any, or they might have a lot. So we developed a process to standardize and measure the amount of RS. And yeah, there's a huge range in products. So I would really encourage someone. The dietary sources can work if that is at all possible. I did make RS Complete, and that's an option. But I would, if that wasn't available for someone, if they were out of the country, I would just focus on dietary sources over the powder blends because they're just too
I see.
inconsistent
That's
otherwise.
very interesting. See, it's so easy to just assume that it has what it says, but it's not necessarily the case.
There is a prescription form of resistant starch that's made. Some people have a genetic defect in which they cannot release glucose from their stores. And if they consume resistant starch, they can have stable blood sugar and basically not go into a coma over the course of an overnight sleep. So it's a big deal. So there are those things that are made and standardized, but they're just not over the counter and they're not
So
cost
we
effective.
covered this, and I did briefly mention probiotics. What do you think about that? What should normal, regular, or people, what should we do regarding probiotics?
They certainly have a place. There's good data that they can benefit certain inflammatory conditions, certain chronic bowel situations. They're not something I say everyone should take all the time. There's more of an effect you can have by having a variety of fibers in the diet. I hear fiber always talked about as a thing, and it's a category. There's 16 kinds of fiber available in common foods. If someone Googles 16 types of fiber, they'll find a big free report that I wrote about that. But the most important thing is really going to have a big variety of food categories. If you cover the bases with those, that's how you feed a healthy flora. If you just add things in, it's just like making compost. If you were to put in bacteria on a compost pile that was just sand, you would never have healthy compost. But if you put a nice mixture of kitchen trimmings and whatnot, you got compost. So it's much more about what you're feeding than just what you're adding in to get the right
So
flora.
let's say that some of us are listening to you and they say, and I see it a lot in the Silicon Valley culture, which I'm close to. People say, you know what, that sounds incredible, but I'm super busy. I'm a CEO of a tech company. I barely have time to go to the bathroom. I'm not going to be able to do all those things myself. I need hand holding. Do you or your company provide that?
We do. Integrative Health, we've got a team of doctors, and we're happy to work with people directly and walk them through these sorts of things and help them with the quick ways around it. But ultimately, the lifestyle you're describing. So let me give you a quick story. I wrote a book about the stress response and how it affects health. And as I was writing it, I was a competitive cyclist. I had younger kids back then. I was practicing. And I read a paper about the effects of a disrupted stress cycle on early death. And there was a study about civil servants in the UK, and they tracked a bunch of them over the course of 4 years, and they measured all these health metrics. One of the ones they measured was salivary cortisol. So if you're healthy, you make morning cortisol and you shut it off at night. It's called your cortisol slope. If your life is too busy, if it's too hectic, if you're too stressed, you might be good in a lot of ways, but the cortisol slope gets thrown off. And what they showed from the study was that the people that died earliest, the second most common explanation was that they were smokers. Not a big surprise. But more so than smoking was a disrupted cortisol rhythm. There was no bigger predictor of early death than an abnormal cortisol cycle. So I read this study. At the time it was past my bedtime. I had put in a full day. I'm working on the manuscript. And I'm like, wow. In my mind, my thought was, I'm doing all the right things. I eat well. I mean, I practice what I preach. I'm training hard. So yeah, I push it now and then, but whatever. I do everything else right. And this study told me that I was kidding myself. That if I was maintaining my stress better and I was heavier and I smoked, I'd have better odds of not dying early.
It's interesting. And this is really something I think that's a huge takeaway, at least for me. In your example, you were doing all the right things. You're just doing too much of them.
Yeah. And that's the message I'd say. If you're someone who's burning the candle at both ends, you're going to be the dead rich guy. There's no way around that. The body cannot sustain that. We need a certain amount of downtime. There's been data showing that working more than 50 hours per week is the same as 2 packs a day on overall cardiovascular risk, smoking 2 packs a day. So yeah, we do
Now,
need some downtime.
you mentioned the cortisol slope. And many of us are listening and we say, okay, great. I don't know my cortisol, slope. Maybe it's great. Maybe it's horrible. I have no idea.
Yeah, simplest thing is if your sleep is a good gauge of that. If you fall asleep well, you sleep through the night, you wake up rested, your mind's not racing at night, it's probably okay. If those things aren't good, that could be off. But it can also, if your energy crashes at set times of day, that's a big predictor. So you always need caffeine in the afternoon, or you wake up and your mind races at 3 in the morning. If there's a recurrent thing like that in the day, that means the cortisol slope is probably not
And of
right.
course, you can get a test, right? If you wanted to.
You can test that. The salivary tests are the best. Blood tests are good for cortisol, but the drawback is you can't do a blood test at midnight. So a cortisol slope, you get readings at different times of day, and then you can see
So
how
now
they
you
adjust.
mentioned coffee. That's a very interesting one. Obviously, most of us really love the taste, the smell, whatever it is. But we know that coffee is not a panacea, and it does have some drawbacks. How do you feel about coffee, in general?
Complex topic. I think most people could consume a cup or two a day of coffee or tea and take it or leave it, no big thing. When someone really depends upon it for their energy, or if someone panics at the idea of missing a dose, there's probably something wrong there. They're probably better off having a different relationship with it and making it an occasional treat or something. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Christianson, I know that we can talk for 5 hours. You're so chock full of information. But for the lazy, among us, and we want to be held, what do we need to do?
For 85% of those listening, the biggest thing you can do to improve your health, if you do smoke, that's your step one. If you don't smoke, the most important thing you can probably do is trim away a few pounds of that fat from inside the organs. And that's what the Metabolism Reset Diet can guide you through. Once you've done that, people typically see between 5 to 15 pounds of weight change per 28-day cycle. And the cool thing is that the biggest health benefits come from just that first few pounds. When it's done right, that's where all the health changes come in from. So less inflammation, less chronic pain, more steady energy levels, fewer cravings, better brain function, lower cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar. It doesn't take massive restructuring weight loss to see those health benefits. There are those who say, that's great. I feel better, but I want to see some more come off. It's okay. They can repeat that. And I talk about how often you can do it. But for most people, that's the most high mileage thing you can do to radically
And to get in
improve
touch
your
with you
health.
and your staff, how?
Yeah, just drchristianson.com, drchristianson.com. And from there, I link to the clinic and I link to consult options and books and education. I literally have thousands of articles online. So almost any topic you could think of, you can search the topic, my name, but
So for
it's all
those who
there.
do want to be in touch with you and your clinic, you are in Minnesota. I assume they can get a lot of the knowledge, the consultant, the guidance by Zoom or phone.
My clinics in Arizona, my doctors work with people in Arizona, California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah. So most of the Southwest, we do direct medical care. We also do consults that are available certain times of year. Those are available to people anywhere, regardless of their geography. But yeah, drchristianson.com talks about all of
Dr.
that.
Christianson, I really want to thank you for taking your time and sharing this with us. I know that many of the viewers will look things up, will look at the diet. Extremely beneficial, very useful. Thank you so much for being with us.
You had some great questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, thank you for sharing
Same
this,
here.
Adiel. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining me today for the second part of our amazing interview. If you didn't catch part 1, don't miss out. The link is in the description below for you. And be sure to click the subscribe button for more videos.